Campus Brunch, Campus FM 103.7. Richard Stedall is in the studio and he's going to talk about the Malta bus transport story. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning, Colin. Good to be back again.
And Paul Gallia, who is always here in the studio as well on a Monday when we have this conversation. Paul is the researcher and expert about the Malta railways and the Malta trams. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning again. Good morning to everybody.
Paul introduced me to Richard. Richard is the main man, the main researcher into the history of the Malta bus transport system. We've been the last few weeks going from the very first bus in Malta way back in the 1910s, was it? No.
1904, 1905 was the first one. So
Indeed. We skipped a week last week because it was a public holiday, but we're back today and till the end of this season, as in till the end of June, we'll be on a Monday going through with the story until we conclude with nowadays, with the present day. In fact, with the last week of June, we're agreeing to do a session on a Monday and on the Friday as well to conclude everything and perhaps even speak to a special guest. But more about that in the future. For the moment, we're going to focus on today. Richard is doing his research, by the way, together with the Malta Archives in Rabat.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that, Richard, just as an introduction as usual.
Okay, so yes, I am the coordinator of the Malta Bus Archive project, which sits inside the Memorja all sound and visual archive at the National Archives of Malta in Rabat.
A sort of Maltese social history of the last century or so.
Yeah, it's a case of what we've got within Project Memorja. We've got certain key themes that have already been, we've been out interviewing people and that sort of thing. And my area of specialism is, the Maltese bus industry. As I say, from the very first bus that arrived in December 1904 right up to now, and in fact to a certain extent making sure that we're recording things that might happen in the future. So as announcements are made about possible new technology and that sort of thing, it's making sure that that's recorded for future reference as well.
And for the benefit of our listeners, we'll mention them again at the end. Contacts and more information about what you talk about can be found online.
Yes, so the Malta Bus Archive has a YouTube channel where we've got a number of video lectures, plus we do an audio-visual version of these talks. So by adding some photographs and images as we talk about things, it does help people kind of sort of visualise what's been said about things. We've also got a very active Facebook group, and
so many amazing pictures.
Yes,
keep coming up, either from your research or people sending in their own individual pictures.
Indeed, actually they tend to be the most exciting images. Somebody suddenly finds a picture of grandfather who's no longer with us, but with his bus back in the 20s or 30s or something like that. An image that's never been seen publicly before. And that really makes my day. That makes it worthwhile getting out of bed whenever you see images like that come in. So
online, the Malta Bus Archive, it's very easy to find.
Yes, yeah. If you just either on YouTube or on Facebook, if you search for Malta Bus Archive, you'll find us. Alternatively, if you want to contact me by email, Malta Bus Archive, all as one word, @gmail.com.
Fantastic. So let's start the story. We are now in the late 1940s.
Correct. Yes. So 3 weeks ago now, we covered World War II. So we're picking up the picture today, looking.
Oh, of course, because 3 weeks ago was World War II.
Yes.
The week after was Gozo. The whole story of Gozo from beginning to end.
That's right.
Then we skipped a week because of the public holiday.
Yep.
So now we're in the 1940s.
That's just it. We're back onto the main island now, and today we're going to look at the period 1946 through to the end of the 1960s. So let's have a look at the late 1940s. The Second World War has finished. The state of the bus fleet is pretty dire. There'd been such great shortages of materials during the actual conflict that a lot of buses are no longer on the road and need to be completely replaced with new ones. Those that are still on the road are often in very poor condition. There were very few new tyres around, so a lot of the tyres were bald. A lot of the glass in the windows wasn't able to be replaced during the conflict, so you ended up with metal, sort of flattened oil drums and that sort of thing being used to replace some of the glass
panes.
The window. Yeah.
Oh wow. Of course, because of the shipping to Malta had been disrupted.
Yes.
During the war and even after the war, it took some time for it to come back to normal, right?
Indeed, and what supplies did get through were, primarily for the military. So diesel, tyres, engine parts and all that sort of thing. The military got first pick. Civilian vehicles being used by the military then got second pick, and anything that was left. There were some great shortages. So it's a case, as I say, it was trying to sort of rebuild the existing buses and, most importantly, build new ones. Now, as you say, it took a little while for materials to start to come through. So what the government did for the first and up until sort of the 1980s, only time really, was allow bus bodying material from overseas to come in. Now that came in a couple of ways. Joseph Gazan of the British Motor Company, the Ford dealer on the island, he was given permission to import a number of steel-framed bus bodies from a company called Wayne in America. Now they primarily built sort of school buses and things. And these bus bodies that arrived, the three different lengths, but they were much wider than what you were used to, and in some cases a lot longer. And they were restricted, and they were primarily used on the Sleamer routes, and they were primarily restricted to kind of sort of just what was known as Route B within the Sleamer routes, because that was the route that stuck to the straightest roads, the widest roads, because otherwise, if they were trying to sort of take these big buses up through the old part of Sleamer, they wouldn't have fit it.
There's a surprising amount of narrow streets in the back streets of Sleamer, just like in the villages.
Yeah, exactly. So you had these steel-framed bodies from America, and this is at a time when all the local craftsmen who were building bus bodies was still using wooden frames. So these bodies were to a certain extent a lot stronger, but the vehicle was a lot heavier and therefore of course used more fuel. So it was sort of swings and roundabouts really as to the benefits. But what also was allowed were 4 buses from the UK, which actually arrived with bodywork by a company in the UK called Dupel, on some new Bedford OB chassis.
Now, this name Dupel remained for many years, adorning many Maltese buses.
Indeed.
In fact, I remember seeing Dupel Dominant.
Yes,
it was like a legend written on many Maltese buses, even right up to the 90s.
Well, indeed. Well, what happened was in the 1980s, when a lot of second-hand vehicles came in from the UK, a number of them were coaches that were then sort of downgraded for use as buses here on the island, and a number of them, had Dupel dominant bodies, which was why it got written on large. But yes, this is the same company, Dupel, and 4 of these vehicles arrived on Malta, but otherwise everything continued to be bodied, so that the chassis would come in from overseas. But the bodywork would be built by the various skilled craftsmen here on the island. One of the sources of chassis was second-hand military lorries. A lot more of that happened in the 50s, but even from 1946 onwards, some of the chassis used for these big Wayne bodies from America were extended Ford V8 chassis that had been trucked in the military, and then Gazan got the chassis extended in their workshops, assembled the bodywork, because these bodies that came from America arrived as kits, and then they were assembled in the Gazan's workshop in Zira.
It's funny that this kind of thing, Paul, maybe you'd back me up on this. There's a trend even up till very recently. I don't know if they still do it, but even in the small pickup trucks, that they would, like the local importers or even local individuals would order a sort of chassis, like the cab and the chassis, and then in Maltese they'd say they'd build il kasha, amilu kasha for wara, and it would be a locally built. In fact, most pickup trucks up till recently, I mean, nowadays they probably leave them the way they are. They order a specific pickup, but most pickups in up to a certain point used to have a local box
It was something standard.
Yeah. So this kind of craft, which Richard is telling us about,
even some models which were imported from Japan, the kasha,
the box,
the pickup area would be manufactured locally
out of wood, for example,
wood and metal.
And in fact, what I've actually been able to find as I've been indexing some of the old vehicle files, not just the bus files, but some of the old lorry files that are at Transport Malta and things as well, is that actually some of these sort of truck bodies that were added to the chassis cabs were actually built by the same people who built the bus bodies.
Absolutely,
because it was all kind of the same thing. So I found several cases where kind of bus builders, or what we traditionally think of as bus builders, were also bodying lorries and vans and
you still see some of these lorries actually in the construction industry, especially the older ones with the flat nose and lots of colours and the bare feel, that little writing on the side, and some of them are still used in the industry, and the back part would have been manufactured locally.
So
anyway, Richard,
so as I say, various new vehicles were bought in. What we did see was the third and final generation of Thornycroft bus chassis come to Malta. Now, listeners may remember from the previous talks that the very first buses in 1905 were built on Thornycroft chassis, and that the much bigger BMC buses that arrived in 1929 and then went off to Egypt in 1931 were the second generation of Thornycroft buses. So, as I say, in around about sort of 1947-48, two Thornycroft sturdy chassis arrived and were bodied as buses. One of them does still survive. It's in private preservation.
Here in Malta?
Yes, indeed. It was withdrawn and replaced in 2003. It's been sort of garaged ever since. It's not been restored yet, but it is safe and secure and undercover, which is the main thing.
And what year is it from?
So that was 1947-48. And in fact, it's a case of one of the things I'll be talking about in a minute is what are known as sort of normal control and forward control vehicles. So a normal control vehicle has the engine sticking out the front and an obvious bonnet. A forward control vehicle, either in the case of a bus, the engine sat next to the driver, or it's even kind of sort of amidships between the axles, or later on kind of sort of engines at the rear. But one of these, or both of these Thornycroft buses, were effectively the first fully forward control vehicles as buses that arrived in Malta. But we'll come on to those in a bit. So that kind of sort of brings through the 40s. It was mending existing buses, extending a lot of them. So vehicles from the 30s, extending the chassis, getting the existing bodies extended, so they still had that very square 1930s look about them, but they were a lot longer. Sometimes moving the entrance from the rear of the vehicle to the front of the vehicle and things. And as I say, in increasing numbers, the late 40s got going of newly built buses as well.
So, for the benefit of our listeners who want to see pictures of the kind of stuff, the kind of things that Richard is explaining, we put together a recording of this in this chat, and Richard adds lots of pictures from his research, right, to the recording, and then the recording will be available on YouTube via the Malta Bus Archive page, which you can subscribe to, and I will also put a link on the Campus Brunch Facebook page of each of our chats. chat, so you can actually listen to the chat again and see pictures of the kind of thing that Richard is talking about.
Indeed, and the good thing is that as we are sort of getting closer and closer to the current day, there are more and more photographs that I can actually use to illustrate these talks. So.
And for those of you perhaps who are not so much into the machinery, the pictures also include, vistas of Malta, how it used to be, the people who ran these buses or owned these buses.
Yeah.
So they're real time warp, nostalgic experience about the social life around them and the families, etc.
Exactly. It's a case of, the actual vehicles, the services, the routes and the fares and all that sort of thing. That's just 50% of the industry. It's the people who are just as important, and that's where a lot of my research is going these days. Sadly, for the last 18 months, it's been quite limited as to what I can do, but the plan is to actually now start to get back out there myself and a couple of volunteers and things, and actually sort of go out and initially just sort of casual chats with people, find out what they know, record their memories and things
about their grandparents or their parents
That's
who were
just
involved.
Or if they're elderly, kind of when they used to maybe work in the industry and things. And for a very limited number of people, what we can actually do is video record those interviews. They will then sit permanently within the National Archives, so that people in the future can actually listen to people talking, primarily in Maltese, because it's a case of, although I don't speak much Maltese, the important thing is gathering that language that was unique to the industry, and that's why I've really pushed that. By using my volunteers who do speak Maltese, not only do the interviewees feel a lot more comfortable speaking in Maltese, it's capturing those phrases and the language and descriptions of things that are unique to the bus industry.
Richard, we've arrived at the 1950s, so I ask you to continue the story, the saga.
Sure. Okay. So yes, the 1950s. Quite a lot happened during the 50s. We continued to see a certain amount of older 1930s vehicles being rebodied, but what we saw a lot of were the use of these ex-military lorry chassis, so Fords, but especially Dodge and Bedford, either the Bedford OY, which was the normal control vehicle with the engine sticking out the front, or there was the four-wheel drive Bedford QL, which was a forward control vehicle which had the engine kind of sort of in the cab with the driver. But there were also a few other military vehicle makes, such as Commer, Chevrolet and in International. But when it came to new vehicles, by far the biggest and most common sort of thing for new vehicles was the Thames ET6 and ET7. Now, Thames was a brand name used by the British arm of the Ford Motor Company, and it was primarily kind of sort of used as a lightweight truck chassis, but here in Malta and other places around the world, such as Uruguay and South America, they were used as ideal kind of sort of lightweight bus chassis as well. And being a Ford product, all the chassis were imported by Joseph Kazan, and he actually operated most of the vehicles. Around about 100 came in between around about 1949 and 1953-ish. Mostly they were used on the Slima route, but most, although not all, of the other routes had at least one of these vehicles on as well. But we then also started to see the lightweight Bedford SB chassis start to arrive. Now, that was a popular type around the world for the use as buses, especially within the British Empire, and as well as several dozen coming here to Malta. Hundreds and hundreds went off to places like New Zealand, Fiji, a lot of the Caribbean islands and things. So, and again, what happened was they arrived here as chassis, and then they'd be bodied locally. Although there were some here that had British bodies on, and they were with the British military. All three services, the Royal Navy, the Army, and the RAF, had a fleet of their own buses, primarily for moving service personnel around the island, but occasionally moving families or even some of the school children around as well. And they used almost entirely as standard these Bedford SB chassis with standard sort of military grade bodywork built in the UK,
which would arrive whole.
Would arrive whole. But then what tended to happen was, as they were kind of sort of, they'd maybe do 8 years of service with the military, and then they'd be deemed surplus to requirements, and rather than ship them back to the UK to be disposed of, they were just disposed of locally. So what would happen is dealers would buy these vehicles from the military. They weren't allowed to use them with their British-built bodies on them, so the bodies would be scrapped, and then the local craftsmen again would build bodywork on them. And again, a number of those actually still survive, either privately preserved or restored and now available for hire and things. So
this is from the 50s.
So that was from the 50s, and
which
then,
is 70 years ago,
Yeah.
or which is a long time.
But these military vehicles continued to arrive through the 60s and even into the sort of the very early 70s, and certainly a lot of the rebuilding and rebodying them for local route bus use primarily took place in the 60s and in the 70s. The other big thing that was happening during the 50s was a big effort to convert all the buses from petrol engine to diesel engines, because it was deemed that they were a lot more fuel efficient, that the diesel engines were more powerful as well. The buses were getting bigger, they were getting heavier. Obviously a bigger bus can carry more passengers. At the end of the war, a standard route bus would have seated 26 passengers. Very quickly the allowance was increased to 28. By the early 50s you were looking at 32, and by the mid 50s it had increased to 36. So these bigger buses, by not only was the bus heavier, it was carrying a heavier load.
Of course.
So therefore you needed more powerful engines. The most powerful, the most popular, of the engines was the Perkins P6, often supplied through Mamo Brothers.
And they're very rugged engines, as in, like, you can put really low-grade fuel in them, including, there was a rumor about kerosene, and it's, like, cheaper, so, anything to cut corners.
Exactly. But there were also things like the Leyland 300. Although, after these two Thornycroft buses that arrived in the 40s, there weren't any new Thornycroft chassis arrived. What did happen in the 50s were there were probably a couple of dozen Thornycroft TR6 diesel engines which were used as conversions, and in the Maltese standard way of doing things, often the name of the engine manufacturer appears on the front of the bus rather than the name of who built the chassis. So that's why 50s and 60s you saw certain buses running around saying Thornycroft on them, even though all it was that they'd had at some point a Thornycroft engine. Or
Perkins. Yes, you're right. I remember that. Because what we're talking about here in the 50s, there's a good chance that in the 80s or possibly early 90s, who I'm 47 now, but when I was a teenager, I'd have ridden in a bus from the 50s right up to, in my memory, like 20 years ago.
To be
they
honest,
were still very common.
To be honest, a lot of the buses that were built in the 50s and into the 60s and things were still running until 10 years ago.
Until 10 years ago,
when Arriva took over. So
what we consider like the traditional Malta bus that everybody pictures, the ones with the sort of little nose at the front and or the flat front. But they started coming around in the 50s and 60s.
Correct.
Because up till now, what we've spoken about are buses that are in private collections and museums cars and whatever. Now we're talking about the buses that we all remember right up to Arriva.
Yes, that's just it. And what's good is that, and we'll probably sort of talk about it in a fortnight's time when we look at more recent times. But there are, sort of two consortia of operators who are now spending a lot of time, money, and energy restoring these buses so that they can be used for tourist routes, for wedding hires, and that sort of thing.
Photo shoots,
and they're recreating the old liveries that the village buses used to be in.
I saw some lovely pictures this last couple of weeks on Facebook of some company that has about 6, and they were all lined up in different colours. Beautiful.
Richard, if I may ask, going back to the Thames.
Yes.
Am I right in saying the police, the Malta police, had a Thames bus?
Yes, they had 4, and what it was the Thames chassis normally when they arrived from the UK were a certain length, and all the ones used as route buses once they got to Malta were extended so that they could fit 32 and then 36 passengers in. The 4 that the Malta police had until late 70s, early 80s, were the original unextended length, so they were noticeably shorter. The bodywork on them was built by Frank Aquilina of Paola, who built a lot of bodywork in from the 30s onwards, starting. But so they looked pretty much like short versions of the Malta route buses, but obviously in the dark blue livery that the police use.
Yes, it did not seem that the difference in length.
Yeah, and that was primarily the big difference.
I remember a particular photo. I remember the police on the buses, on these Thames.
Yep.
But there was a particular photo taken at what we call in Maltese Salib Talolia at Sigewi. There was some event or some consecration either of the cross or of the chapel, the wee chapel that is falling to bits at the moment.
Sure.
And there was one of these buses there,
parked at the side. Obviously, the police had been taken there for crowd control or whatever. And fantastic. Yes, obviously, it's the wonderful thing about these old pictures.
Later, I'm sure you'll talk about them. The police took over certain buses which were used by the services.
Yes.
I'll leave
it again, that's probably more next week when we look at the 70s and 80s. So,
okay, Richard, so we're still in the 50s.
Still in the 50s. So a couple of other kind of sort of noticeable events that happened in the 50s. The first was around about 1953, Joseph Kazan, who by then owned over 100 buses, and I think owned all the buses that were on the Slima route. He decided that he was going to sell off his buses and concentrate on his other business interests. So what he started to do was he offered most of his existing bus drivers first option as to whether they wanted to buy a bus. Some of them bought them outright, some of them were on a hire purchase scheme, and therefore the bus remained in Joe Gazan's name until the full amount of money had been paid. So we actually see a couple of cases where it was kind of the early 60s before technically he sold his last bus. But he hadn't, it would have been 53, 54 that he really sort of started selling them off. And what that did mean was that the buses on the Slima route all, to a certain extent, changed colour. Back in the 30s, the Slima route was roughly 50-50. 50% was owned by Joe Gazan's BMC company, and they were an overall dark green colour with just a white band round just underneath the window line. And then the rest were owned by what was known as the Slima Motor Bus Company, SMBC, which was a consortium of all the individual operators. And they had what people today think of as the traditional Slima livery of a mid-green bottom, a dark green band under the window, and a white top. And slowly but surely, Joe Gazan bought out all these individual owners, and therefore the SMBC livery disappeared. So that by the time we got after the war and into the very early 50s, all the buses on the Slima route were in this overall dark green. But once he started selling off the buses, they all went back to the two-tone green with white, which is again helps because sometimes again when you look at old photographs of the bus terminus around the city gate at Valletta, where the fountain is now, although it wasn't at the time, you can kind of sort of date some of these photos. Are the buses in dark green? Are they in the other livery? And that kind of gives you, is it pre-1953 or post-53-54?
And there's probably a few colour photos starting in the 50s, right?
I've not seen any full sort of genuine colour photos of the 50s of these buses in the dark green. I've seen one or two black and white images that have been coloured and things to give you an idea of what it was like. But
let's conclude about the 1950s.
I've just got one very quick one other little saga that happens, which was interesting. In 1953, a dealer tried to bring into the country some buses from London, some second-hand buses that had the bodies already on them. They managed to get one into the country until the government kind of sort of went, no, if you bring them in, it's got to be the chassis only and things, because there was such an uproar from in the local press that this was going to completely wipe out the local bus bodying industry and things.
Of course, by that time, a lot of people would have got involved in the industry, so there were a lot of people employed in it and businesses.
A further 6 actually arrived, but they never got further than the quayside. They were impounded by the customs because there wasn't permission for them to be brought into the country. And after a couple of months of sat on the quayside, they were actually sent off to the oil fields in Libya for use over there.
Oh, wow.
And there were meant to be originally up to 20 of these vehicles coming from London. And as I say, one got here. In the end, pretty much all of the rest ended up in Libya.
Oh, wow. This sounds a little bit like a rumour I heard. I'm not sure, perhaps. Correct me if I'm wrong, if you know. But for a long time, double-decker buses weren't allowed in Malta. But someone had imported a few, and they just were garaged for a few years until finally licenses were granted for them to be used for these tours.
I was going to say that
was much later.
That's a 21st century issue, and we'll cover that in a couple of weeks' time. But yes, that's definitely something I will be covering.
It's a question of sort of a business person thinking, let me try something new, and they sort of jump the gun a little bit, and then they realize, oops, I don't actually have a permit for this, and the permit is not going to be forthcoming, sort of thing.
Yes, yeah, there was a bit of confusion, I think, as to whether these vehicles were going to be allowed or not. But we'll look at that later. So anyway, that wraps up the 50s, and next we'll talk about the 60s. So we've talked about the late 40s, we've talked about the late 50s. Only makes sense to now talk about the 60s. What happened during that decade? Well, we continued to see quite a few newly built buses continuing to arrive. More of the Bedford SBs I was talking about, including some that use the second-hand military bodies and things. What we also started to see were a number of what are called sort of heavyweight chassis, second-hand ones arriving from the UK. Initially, chassis that dated from sort of the late 30s and that sort of thing. So AEC Regals, Leyland Tigers.
Probably going very cheap in the UK.
Yeah, by the time we sort of looked at the mid to late 50s, early 60s, these vehicles were coming up to being sort of 20 years old. They'd been primarily coaches, so pretty much at the end of their life. So again, standard thing, the bodywork was scrapped in the UK, the chassis were sent out. And what we then started to see in the 60s was more, instead of sort of second-hand coach chassis, it was second-hand lorry chassis, so AEC Mercuries, Bedford SLs. Well, the SL was kind of the lorry version of the SB chassis. They were very similar. And what happened in 1965 was that there was a regulation was passed that said, we don't really want you to use second-hand chassis anymore. We want newly built chassis used. It was the government's way of trying to up the quality of the vehicles being, the chassis being used to build these new buses and things. So one enterprising businessman found a good way of getting round that. He bought these second-hand AEC and Bedford chassis in the UK that had been lorries, and often they were no more than 5 or 6 years old, so they were sort of just coming up onto the second-hand market. He had them disassembled in the UK, shipped out in crates effectively as boxes of spare parts, reassembled them in his workshop, and then they counted as new chassis.
Viva Malta, Paul.
So, and it was
always find a way around for a loophole.
And that was permissible. So, there was probably a couple of dozen chassis that over the mid-60s came in that way. Type thing.
Love it.
But a few other things that happened. We've talked a lot about sort of the vehicles and things. A couple of important things that happened during the 60s when it came to the actual route network. There had been all these individual routes to the villages and things. Some of the individual routes were quite small. They only had maybe 5-10 vehicles allocated to them. So a couple of them were merged together. Now, one that was merged together in the mid-60s was the Sijiwi route and the Zeebrugge route. They both used kind of sort of yellow buses. Zeebrugge didn't have any additional colour. It was just yellow and then the white roof. Sijiwi had a red band round the middle. And what they did was they merged them together into the Zeebrugge and Sijiwi route, and it used yellow with an orange band around the middle, which was fairly close to what was then used from 1995 onwards. 95 onwards, it was a darker shade of orange. Back in the 60s for that merge route, it was a lighter shade of orange. But you see photographs from the 60s of these vehicles in the merged livery, and you kind of you sometimes have to think, is that the 60s? Is that more recent and things? Because just at first glance, and then the other merger was the Moster route and the Nashar route. Moster had been brown with a white roof. Nashar had been a slightly lighter shade of brown with a pale yellow band around the middle and then the white roof. And they were merged together. And now originally the plan was that actually they were all going to get merged into the much bigger Malta group, which was white with a blue band around the middle. But that plan was dropped, so it was just a combined Moster and Nashar route, and they used mid-brown, dark brown band, and then the white roof as the combined livery. So again, when looking at old photographs, especially if they are colour, you can kind of sort of date them from the colour that the buses are.
I wonder who sat around, making these decisions. We're going to use this colour. We're going to use this band. We're going to use. Was there a committee? I mean,
well, there was something called the Traffic Control Board, which was set up in the 1930s. In fact, in 1930 actually, and certainly was still around well into the 80s. It was a public body in as much that the government would appoint each year the board members. There was normally, if not the commissioner of the police, one of his deputies was on the board. For a while, they'd hold their meetings at police headquarters. They also, I found, correspondents used to sometimes hold meetings at Castile in the palace and things. But for a public body, it's interesting that nobody knows what happened to their files and in the paperwork. It's certainly not at the National Archives. I've asked contacts at Transport Malta as the natural sort of successor to the things like the Traffic Control Board. Nobody had even heard of the Traffic Control Board. I've tried asking contacts at police headquarters. Again, people sort of look blankly at me and go, don't know what you're talking about. So, for a public body, these files should still exist
somewhere.
But where? There is the possibility that, yes, they've been thrown out many decades ago, but it would be a shame if they have.
They would have made the public registry, would they? Because that's marriages and births and things like that.
No, that's just it. In theory, they should have been given to the National Archives decades ago. But nobody
mind you,
seems to
these things happen. I mean,
well, yeah,
in every country, I guess. Sometimes things get mislaid, lost, or Anyway, okay, so we're in the 60s.
We're in the 60s. So the other thing that happened with the route network was that we started to see the first buses going to the Bugiba and Aura Peninsula. Now, what you've got to remember is that I've seen a map dating from the 50s, and that whole peninsula that these days is a dense warren of housing and hotels and
apartments and pubs.
That sort of thing.
Yes.
Was an empty peninsula. It had about 2 or 3 farmhouses on it.
Wow.
And it was basically just, otherwise there was nothing there, just agricultural land and quite rocky ground and things.
So not even hotels there yet?
No, not in
No.
the
Wow.
in the 50s. But in the 60s you started to see that first bit of development on the peninsula. And the bus services started by just being summer beach services, taking the locals to the beach and things. But as the 60s went on, and especially into the 70s, then you actually started to get a regular bus service as more housing was built, as the first hotels were built and things. So what else happened? Well, we saw the withdrawal of the last of the very square-looking 1930s style bus bodies. A few of those, albeit much rebuilt, but they had survived into the 60s, spotted because they had like a sun visor built out above the top of the cab to give a little bit of shade to the...
from the windscreen, from the front.
And so the last of those went. And also in 1966, the bus builder Michael Barbara built at his Lure workshop the first sort of coach body. Up until then, yes, there'd been the separate kind of sort of private hire fleet, but all they basically were standard route buses, but in a cream colour. There was no sort of comfort of extra seats or that sort of thing. But yeah, 1966, Michael Barbara builds this first sort of coach style body on an AEC Mercury chassis. The vehicle does still exist, although, as with all these things, it's been much rebuilt over the years and visually looks a bit different now. But it's in the fleet of the Malta Bus Co-op and is used for sort of tourist hires and weddings and bits and pieces. And it's actually painted in the light blue and cream that was used from the 80s and 90s for the coach fleet.
Oh yes, I remember this. What we used to call privates, Paul. Yeah. So yeah, that couple of minutes.
That's fine. Well, I'm going to say that pretty much kind of sort of brings us towards the end of the 60s. One final thing was the fact that you started to see minibuses starting to appear with hire garages. So rather than just hiring out cars and things, they'd start to hire out minibuses. A lot of them were Volkswagen, kind of sort of based on the combi and camper van design that you still see today.
Oh, the famous Volkswagen Type 2.
Yeah. So
so the first minibuses, which eventually we associate with the Transit van, were Volkswagen Mark IIs.
Yep. So again, it's a case of there are photographs from the 60s, and you can sort of see in the background these Volkswagen minibuses. It really wasn't until the early to mid 70s that the first Mark I Transit started to arrive, and then obviously later on, Malta still is to this day, home of the Transit.
Which is a legendary van in the UK, isn't it?
Indeed.
Such a huge following.
It's just a shame they're no longer built in the UK. They're just built in Turkey these days. But anyway, that pretty much wraps up the 60s. Next week we'll look at the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But just as a reminder, if you want to get in touch with me, the email address is maltabusarchive@gmail.com, or if you search on either Facebook or YouTube for Malta Bus Archive, you'll find the relevant pages there.
Fantastic. So we'll talk again in a week. Yep. Richard Stedall. As we said, there's the Malta Bus Archive on YouTube, the Malta Bus Archive on Facebook. You told us the email address. I will post a link to the YouTube reproduction of this conversation, which you will add pictures to.
Yeah, hopefully by the end of Wednesday, by Wednesday evening, I should hopefully have been able to upload that. So